We celebrate that God is with us, and I imagine, like me, that many of you come to this place to encounter that God that is with us, because sometimes outside of a place designed to bring us into the presence of God, sometimes it's hard to keep that connection going. And in these sermons this month, we've really been trying to focus on how can we bridge between what happens here in our faith and what happens in the wider community around us. We've called the sermon of series of sermons, Building Bridges, Social Justice, and Faith. And so we've been looking at how to build bridges over gaps in knowledge and in perspective and experiences, and then ultimately to build that bridge between our faith and what happens in the wider society. The last 2 weeks we looked at very particular social issues and issues of justice around immigration and race relations. And today, as we conclude the series, I want to shift just a little bit to look, instead of looking at a particular issue, to look at, once we identify one, how can we be effective at somehow having an impact on that issue? And I want to start that by asking a leading question, because I have a story I want to tell. So here's the leading question. Have you ever had an idea that you were so excited about, you just couldn't imagine any possibility that no one else would be that excited about it, and so you just run forward with it? I ask you that question because I want to share my idea. It starts with cats. Imagine with me, we get some cats. That's the first component. The second component is Shetland ponies, little horses. There's one more component. A whole bunch of Stetson hats. Now, here's what I want you to imagine with me. Maybe you're on vacation and you see this sign for the cat ranch, and you think, well, that's intriguing. I wonder what happens at the cat ranch. And you go there and you find cats and Shetland ponies and Stetsons, and you have the opportunity literally to herd cats. I think it's brilliant. So much so that I really don't have a whole lot of time for people that might point out things about cats that would make this not work, or things about horses that might make this not work, or any other thing. And now, some might be grateful that I don't have the resources to go out and buy a cat ranch and start this up. But I want you to imagine for just a second, if instead of talking about herding cats, we were talking about poverty, or some other social issue or issue of social justice, and I had this really great idea, and I thought it was so great I wasn't really interested in listening to some of the things that might not make it not be quite effective. Imagine if I had the resources of an individual, of a community, maybe even of a national organization, and imagine what might happen. Well, that was the case for Ernesto Sorelli, who is an Italian working with an NGO aid organization in Africa. And I want you to hear his story of what happened.
Everything I do, and everything I do professionally, my life, has been shaped by 7 years of work as a young man in Africa. From 1971 to 1977, I look young, but I'm not. I worked in Zambia, Kenya, Ivory Coast, Algeria, Somalia, in projects of technical cooperation with African countries. I worked for an Italian NGO. And every single project that we set up in Africa failed. And I was distraught. I thought, age 21, that we Italians were good people and we were doing good work in Africa. Instead, everything we touched, we killed. Our first project, the one that has inspired my first book, Ripples from the Zambezi, was a project where we Italians decided to teach Zambian people how to grow food. So we arrived there with Italian seeds in southern Zambia, in this absolutely magnificent valley, going down to the Zambezi River, and we taught the local people how to grow Italian tomatoes and zucchini. And of course, the local people had absolutely no interest in doing that, so we paid them to come and work, and sometimes they would show up. And we were amazed that the local people in such fertile valley would not have any agriculture. But instead of asking them how come they were not growing anything, we simply said, thank God we're here. Just in the nick of time to save the Zambian people from starvation. And of course, everything in Africa grew beautifully, and we had these magnificent tomatoes. In Italy, a tomato would grow to this size, in Zambia to this size. And we could not believe. And we were telling the Zambians, look how easy agriculture is. When the tomatoes were nice and ripe and red, overnight, some 200 hippos came out from the river and they ate everything. And we said to the Zambians, my God, the hippos. And the Zambians said, yes, that's why we have no agriculture here. Why didn't you tell us? You never asked. I thought it was only us Italians blundering around Africa, but then I saw what the Americans were doing, what the English were doing, what the French were doing, and after seeing what they were doing, I became quite proud of our project in Zambia, because you see, at least we fed the hippos.
Maybe you've seen this happen, though. So many times, from a distance, a social issue looks like it could be fixed so simply if we just had the resources and the will to do it. But down on the ground, and more importantly, in the river, there are often hippos. And you don't find out about those complications unless you go and listen and ask questions. Now, I'm saying this because I want to take you back to the Scripture. The Scripture are filled with different social issues. We see examples of those happening. The Scripture, though, traces all of them back to a much broader human issue, if you will, the human condition. We look to the Scriptures, and perhaps you look around and see this, that humans are capable of such incredible beauty and creativity and love. And yet, in certain circumstances, sometimes when stress is placed upon them, sometimes when they have an overabundance of the resources they need and don't need to depend on others, it gets twisted. They begin to withdraw from a relationship with God, convinced that they know better how to live their lives and would rather not put up with God's guidance and God's limitations, and they go to do themselves, and they begin to separate from God, and then they begin to separate into groups of us and them, and the beauty turns ugly, and the creative forces turn to destruction, and the love turns to hatred. And so I imagine God sitting watching God's handcrafted creation kind of falling apart, distancing itself from God and from each other, and thinking, how do I fix this issue? And what we find in Jesus is a radical approach that is the model for what Ernesto Sorelli was talking about, what they should have done. They should have listened. Jesus chooses not to fix the problem from on high with a decree or a miracle or something, but rather to come and to live in the midst of the human issue, the social issues, the problems, the condition. And what I find so fascinating about the way God chooses to do this is He chooses to wait for quite a long time before starting to actually tell people what to do. Chooses, in fact, to come as a baby that can't talk or teach anything. That baby grows up, but when you turn to the Scriptures, we don't find any record of anything that Jesus said, and hardly of anything that He did until He's 30. And as I'm going to show you here in a moment, I think Jesus' intentional plan was to come, and before He taught anything and before He told anybody what to do and how to fix their issues, He spent 30 years listening and learning the people. We do have one story in the scripture about Jesus' childhood. It's not until he's at age 12, but we have this one story in the Gospel of Luke, and I want to read it to you today. It's in chapter 2, starting in verse 41. Now, every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." He said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. Now, this story, most people, when they approach this, the first perspective from which they approach it is as a parent, or imagining what it would be like to be a parent to lose your child. Pastors often come to this and use it to draw connections between Jesus as the human and his divine side, and that's why he's drawn to the temple. But today, where I want to focus your attention is on how he is acting when he's in the temple. I want to highlight for you in verse 46, it says, "After 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions." Jesus, the God in human form that presumably knows everything, chooses to go and to listen and to ask questions. The next verse 47 says, "All who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers." And so you might think for a moment, well, his answers, well, perhaps they were asking him questions and he was teaching. Maybe. But there was a way of rabbinical teaching where the rabbis, to help their students learn, they would ask them questions, not because the rabbis didn't know the answers, but because they wanted to test the students and see if they were listening. And so I think it's at least plausible that what Jesus is doing here, we've already been told he's asking questions and he's listening, and it's at least plausible that even in his answers, he is still taking the role of student. I think it becomes more plausible when we consider that nothing Jesus taught, if he taught anything as a child, was ever recorded. We don't have any recorded teachings until another 18 years later. And so this makes sense to me if, as I say, my theory is true, that Jesus chose to spend the first 30 years of his life listening before he started telling people what to do. And then when he finally does, the things that he tells people to do are at one and the same time both simple and incredibly complex. They betray a deep knowledge of human nature and the underlying issues. He comes to them and he teaches them things like, it is all well and good to love your friends, but if you really want to be transformed and if you really want to transform the world, love your enemies. Easy to say, incredibly hard to do. He talks to them about the political situation. They're living under an oppressive and unjust Roman government. And he teaches them things like, if a soldier forces you to walk 1 mile, then walk 2. And be a good citizen and pay your taxes. And he teaches them a number of things that are about being self-sacrificial and doing kindness even to oppressors. He teaches these things that I think you could only teach had you been in the midst of the situation and deeply understood what was going on. And then he formulates it in these very simple to say but very hard to do kinds of teaching. And so this is the pattern that I take away that we should follow as we see social issues and we want to make a difference and we want to impact them, that we need to listen. Even if we have this great idea, we need to ask questions. I've learned this firsthand in our partnerships that we've started with elementary schools, Greenwood Hills and Mark Twain. Years ago, it was just Access instead of the whole church partnering, and it was just Mark Twain. And I was writing an email communication about this, and this was back when Kristen Caesar was on our staff, and I asked her to proof it before I sent it out. And I had referred to Mark Twain as our adopted elementary school. And she asked me if that was really the phrase I wanted to use. And I said, well, why not? And she said, well, when you think about adopting, you have one entity that's in the role of the parent and one that's in the child. Is that what you want our interaction with the schools to be like? And when you're adopting, you have one who has the majority of the resources and one who has the majority of the needs. Is that how you view our connection with the school? And when you talk about adoption, usually with a child, you've got one who has all of the knowledge and one to whom you need to impart it. And she's asking me, is that how you view our schools? Well, of course, no. And so we made that intentional decision to refer to and to live out our connection with the schools as partners, where both entities in the relationship have an equal standing, both have different resources, and both have different needs, and they can fill each other, where we choose to work together and to listen and to go to the schools and ask, you're the ones here in the midst of particularly the issues of poverty for Mark Twain and Greenwood Hills, what do we need to know and what do you need and how can we help? As opposed to coming in and saying, oh, we've got this figured out, this is what you need to do. And so we learned some things through that approach that I'm not sure we could have learned any other way. One of the things we learned early on was that students living in poverty, particularly when they come to Saturday school, many times come having not eaten breakfast and they're hungry. And because they're hungry, they have trouble studying and learning. We could have learned that without asking questions, but we certainly learned it quickly by asking what they needed. And so they needed food, and we were able to structure some help around providing food. We learned that students who are coming out of poverty, by the time they're the age 5, on average have just heard around 30 million fewer words than their wealthier peers. For lots of different reasons, they just don't hear as many words, in part sometimes because both parents are working and they're not home reading stories and doing things like that. But when they show up at school, their vocabulary is significantly smaller than their wealthier peers, and so they understand, even though they're there and paying attention, understand fewer of the things they hear and see and read. And so we started structuring some ways through volunteers and through the Accelerated Reader program of trying to expose kids to more and more words. We learned that kids coming from poverty many times have never had a family member who has been to college. Some of them have never been out of the city of Dallas and have never seen a college. And as a result, many of them don't envision a future that college is a part of and therefore make different choices than their wealthier peers along the way through school. And having learned that, we were able to structure some things around taking some college trips and exposing these students to college and to begin to dream about that as part of their future. I don't know that we could have learned any of these things had we not chosen to structure the relationship as a partnership. Jesus has given us this example of listening first and then trying to talk later. And it's an example I think is so important and I think holds the potential to solve our social issues when we come to them. The world is filled with all kinds of social issues, some of which look so simple to fix if we just were willing to had the resources and the will to go after it. But what we find is when we actually listen and ask questions and partner with others, get in and get to know our neighbors as ourselves, at least as well as ourselves, that we find sometimes there's hippos in the water. Things are more complicated than we anticipated, but by building relationships and listening, we come up with much, much better solutions. Julie reminded us last week that one of the two greatest commandments Jesus gave us was to love our neighbors as ourselves. And she reminded us that in order to do that, we have to get to know our neighbors as ourselves. That is what we try to do here at our church. It's what we will continue to do as we build partnerships in our community and throughout the world so that we can follow that command of Jesus, that model to listen, and that command to love our neighbors as ourselves.